My name is Eleanor Ellie Marks. I'm 72 years old, retired librarian, proud grandmother, and a woman who has always believed in fairness, in kindness, in treating others with the same patience I hope to receive. My family, my daughter, my son-in-law, and my 3 grandchildren lived in other parts of the city, but my grandson, Ryan, had been visiting a lot lately. He was 28, ambitious, and full of ideas, always talking about apps, startups, and business plans that sounded like another world to me. At first, I loved having him around. We baked cookies, talked about the books I loved, and shared long walks down the hilly streets. But I started noticing something. He was never just visiting. He spent hours in my apartment, measuring the rooms, inspecting the old wooden floors, and making phone calls with a quiet intensity that made me uneasy. One evening, after dinner, he sat me down. "Grandma, I need to talk to you," he said, leaning forward, eyes serious. "The apartment. I need it for my startup. It's the perfect location. I know it's your home, and I don't want to upset you, but I need the space for renovations and work. I promise it'll only be temporary." Temporary. The word felt like a punch to the gut. I had been here longer than he'd been alive. My life, my memories, my sanctuary, all potentially at stake for a business venture I barely understood. I tried to negotiate. "Ryan, can't you rent a space downtown? There are so many office spaces available." "It's complicated," he said, almost pleading. "This place has character. I can renovate it, make it perfect, and you can stay nearby, just for a little while." I believed him, partly because he was family, and partly because he smiled like he was on my side. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the apartment, touching the worn wooden banister, the faded wallpaper, the bookshelves I'd stocked over decades. My sanctuary felt fragile, like a paper boat in a storm. Over the next few weeks, subtle things started to change. Notices appeared on the door, maintenance checks, inspection appointments. Boxes I hadn't packed began to accumulate in the corners. Ryan spent more and more time on calls, and whenever I asked about timelines, he always smiled reassuringly, yet evasively. Then came the eviction notice. Signed and stamped. Not a suggestion, not a gentle request. An official notice stating that my apartment would be vacated for renovations within 30 days. My grandson had used my trust, my love, and my history in this home to push me out. If you're still watching or listening, don't go anywhere, because what comes next isn't just about eviction. It's about betrayal, planning, and the kind of justice you don't see coming. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the notice, my hands trembling. I thought about every birthday I'd celebrated here, every holiday meal, every quiet night with a good book. Could a place with so much love be taken from me by someone I raised? By my own grandson? And that's when I made a silent promise. I wouldn't just leave. Not quietly. Not without making him face the consequences of using his family for his ambitions. The game had changed. And the battle for my home, my memories, my dignity, had only just begun. The next morning, I tried to calm myself with a cup of tea, but my mind kept racing. How could Ryan, my own grandson, do this to me? The apartment had been my sanctuary, and yet here was an official eviction notice on my kitchen counter. I felt a hollow pit in my stomach. Betrayal doesn't just hurt, it twists you from the inside. I began noticing small inconsistencies that I hadn't seen before. Ryan had told me the renovation was temporary, but a quick glance at his emails, left accidentally open on my laptop, revealed apartment listings, contractor quotes, and even furniture orders with delivery addresses in other neighborhoods. He wasn't planning a temporary workspace. He was planning a complete takeover. Curiosity turned to determination. I needed proof. I started paying closer attention to every call, every message, every sudden meeting he insisted on. The more I observed, the more I realized how cleverly he had constructed the facade of helping Grandma, while slowly pushing me out. He even enlisted neighbors in his story, telling them I had agreed to the renovation plans. I was furious, and more than that, I was scared. How long had he been planning this? One evening, I followed him quietly after dinner, pretending to go on a walk. He didn't notice me as he met with a real estate agent outside a cafe. I watched from across the street as they discussed rental agreements and the legal loopholes he was exploiting. The betrayal sank deeper. My grandson had taken advantage of my trust, the laws protecting senior citizens like me, and the love I had for him to serve his own ambition. At home, I confronted him gently at first. "Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "why are you doing this? You promised it would only be temporary." He smiled, a practiced, charming smile that masked something darker. "Grandma, it's just business. You know I need space for my startup. You'll be fine. Trust me." I didn't trust him anymore. Not after seeing the emails, the contractor notes, the sly conversations with the agent. My heart ached as I realized how much he had manipulated me, not just with words, but with appearances, with charm, and with my own sense of familial duty. It wasn't just the eviction that shocked me. It was the realization that someone you love can quietly turn their ambition into a weapon against you. And if I didn't act, I'd lose not only my home but the sense of safety and respect I had spent decades cultivating. That night, I sat in the dark living room, the eviction notice glaring like a warning. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. My mind raced with possibilities. I could leave quietly, as he expected. Or I could fight. Not with anger alone, but with strategy, patience, and evidence. I thought about every detail. The contracts, the emails, the empty promises, and the way he had made everyone around him believe I agreed to his plans. I realized I needed more than anger. I needed a plan, one that would ensure he couldn't manipulate or deceive anyone else in our family again. And in that quiet, decisive moment, I promised myself he would face the consequences, and I would reclaim what was mine. The next few days were a storm of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and sorrow clashed inside me, leaving me exhausted yet hyper-aware. I had raised Ryan with love and patience, celebrated every milestone, and guided him through every mistake. And now he was turning that trust into a weapon, threatening to take the one place I had built as my sanctuary. My heart ached with betrayal, but beneath the ache was a spark, a determination I hadn't felt in years. I began quietly gathering evidence. The emails, the texts, the contractor estimates, the receipts for furniture deliveries, everything that showed his plan was deliberate. I photographed the eviction notice, kept a log of every interaction, and even recorded subtle discrepancies in his stories when he spoke about timelines. Each piece was a puzzle I was determined to complete. I also reached out for allies. My daughter, living across town, was horrified when I explained the situation. "Mom," she said, voice trembling, "he can't do this to you. Not after everything you've done for him." Together, we researched San Francisco tenant laws, rent control protections, and legal strategies that could buy me time and leverage. The community I had quietly nurtured over decades, neighbors, friends, even local shopkeepers, became unexpected witnesses. One neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had seen Ryan entering the apartment carrying boxes late at night. She promised to testify if needed. But it wasn't just logistics that consumed me. Emotionally, I felt torn between love and justice. Ryan was still my grandson, and part of me mourned the innocence I had lost. I replayed memories in my mind, baking cookies together, reading bedtime stories, laughing over silly movies. How could the same person be capable of such calculated betrayal? My sorrow was deep, but so was my resolve. I began crafting a plan, not of petty revenge, but of strategic, undeniable accountability. I would confront him with the evidence, involve legal authorities if necessary, and ensure that any attempt to manipulate or gaslight me failed. I envisioned the confrontation carefully, calm, firm, and documented, so no charm or excuses could sway the truth. During this time, I also reminded myself to stay composed in daily interactions. Ryan noticed nothing at first. I smiled, helped him with small errands, and acted as if I were considering his temporary renovation idea. He bragged to neighbors about his upcoming startup, never suspecting that I had seen through every move, every lie. Every boast he made only strengthened my resolve. And then one night, as I sat alone in the living room with the city lights twinkling outside, I drafted a timeline, detailing each instance of manipulation, each promise broken, and each act of deceit. I imagined presenting it calmly, step by step, so that anyone observing would see the full picture. No dramatic outburst, no shouting, just facts, evidence, and a quiet but unshakable force. I realized revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes, it's methodical. It's the slow, unrelenting exposure of truth, the way a steady hand dismantles deception piece by piece. And as I closed my notebook, I felt a clarity that had eluded me during sleepless nights of fear. I would reclaim my home. I would reclaim my dignity. And I would ensure Ryan understood the consequences of turning family into an opportunity for selfish gain. The morning I decided to move, I didn't pack a suitcase. I packed a story, every scrap of proof I had gathered, every email, every receipt, every witness note, all placed neatly into a binder I labeled home. It was heavier than I expected, but it felt good to carry something solid. There's a strange courage that comes when you take evidence into your hands and say, quietly, enough. My first move was practical. I contacted the tenant rights clinic at the community legal center. Older tenants like me were not invisible in San Francisco. There were laws and protections for rent-controlled units and elderly residents. The lawyer I met, a brisk woman named Marissa, smiled in a way that made me feel like someone finally saw me. "You've got time," she said after skimming the binder. "Not forever, but enough to stop an illegal eviction and build a case." That was the leverage I needed. We filed an emergency declaration with the housing department, citing tenant protections and requesting an immediate stay on any forced eviction. That step alone bought me time, a legal pause that prevented Ryan from moving contractors in while we sorted the rest. He was furious when he found out. He raged in his room, slamming doors and accusing me of overreacting. I let him rage. Inside, I felt the quiet thrill of those legal papers doing their job. Next, I went public, carefully. I reached out to a neighborhood blog that often covered local housing stories. I told a condensed truth, a rent-controlled tenant being pushed out under the guise of temporary renovations by a family member who planned to convert the space into commercial use. They ran a short piece within 2 days, and the reaction was immediate. Neighbors sent messages of support. People I'd chatted with for years knocked on the door and offered to be witnesses. Word travels fast in communities where people value home and history. One of the most useful allies turned out to be my downstairs neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, a quiet pianist who kept odd hours and had a porch camera. When he heard what I was doing, he brought over video clips of Ryan hauling boxes late at night and a truck stopping at odd hours, enough to suggest a pattern of preparation, not a brief, temporary fix. Technology that Ryan thought would help him hustle now helped expose him. It was a delicious irony. Mr. Alvarez agreed to provide a written affidavit, and his short, sincere statement would later be powerful in court. I also met with the landlord, an old woman named Mrs. Keaton who owned several units in the building. She listened with that careful look of someone who'd seen landlords and tenants clash before. "If he tried to trick you into signing anything, I will not stand for that," she said. It turned out Ryan had misrepresented the use of the apartment in his informal discussions with her. He'd implied it would remain residential and only be temporary. Mrs. Keaton, once she understood, was more supportive than I expected. She didn't want legal trouble either. She liked the idea of preserving a long-term tenant who had cared for the place. With legal filings in place, press attention growing, and neighbors on my side, I turned to the human element of my plan. I called a small neighborhood meeting and asked Ryan to attend. He came smug, thinking he could charm his way through any awkwardness. I presented my timeline calmly. Dates, emails, photos of contractor estimates, Mr. Alvarez's footage, the eviction notice, and the landlord's statements. I spoke quietly, but each slide landed like a stone in a quiet lake. The neighbors, people who had watched me tend the building's plants and bring casseroles to new parents, were not persuaded by his charm. They had seen his late-night moves and heard his offhand comments. They started asking questions out loud. Ryan's explanations began to sound thin. He tried to turn the meeting to his advantage, talking about creative space and opportunities, and how it would benefit the neighborhood. But when the woman who ran the corner bakery, who had known me for 20 years, stood up and said, "This apartment has been her home for decades. We don't let that go," the room shifted. Community matters when people have lived the same lives together for years. His investors, who were beginning to sniff around the neighborhood looking like venture tourists, didn't show up for community meetings. As the factual pressure mounted, Ryan panicked in the one place he thought he was safe, online. He posted a polished video about entrepreneurship, about using community spaces to spark innovation. He didn't mention my name. He didn't have to. The subtext was loud. I'm building something important. But the community's response was swift and pointed. Comments called him out for exploiting family and questioned the ethics of displacing elderly tenants. The narrative wasn't controlled by him anymore. It was being written for him. One twist I hadn't planned for came when Ryan's primary investor, a small angel group, contacted me quietly. They had done a background check and were alarmed by the potential legal trouble and reputational risk. "We're community-focused," their lead told me on the phone. "We don't want to endorse projects that harm neighbors." Within a week, the funding they'd hinted at started to evaporate. Investors are sensitive to optics. The idea of a startup built on the displacement of an elderly tenant made them nervous. That withdrawal wasn't a moral victory alone. It was practical. Without funding, Ryan couldn't easily convert the apartment into the kind of operation he'd imagined. Pressure was now squeezing him from every side. Legal, communal, and financial. Still, lawyering and public opinion can be slow, and I knew Ryan might try to force a quick move. So I took another step. One that was small but strategic. I reached out to the city's historic preservation office. My building was old, with certain architectural details worth preserving. Once an inspector came and documented that some renovations Ryan planned would require special permits and a review process. Another bureaucratic roadblock appeared. Suddenly, he needed more approvals, more time, and more money. The longer permit processes buy you breathing room, and that breathing room was everything. Throughout this time, I kept my composure. I answered his accusations of making a fuss with quiet facts. I let the binder do the yelling. I let the tape from the porch camera talk. I let the neighbors' voices speak. I let the legal papers stand like a fence between his intentions and my home. It was cunning, not cruel, and it worked. There were, of course, nights when I felt raw. I'd sit on the windowsill, look down at the street where I'd once pushed Ryan in a stroller, and let the grief come. But grief and strategy can live together. Sorrow can sharpen resolve. I wanted him to learn that houses aren't mere assets. They hold lives, histories, and memories. I wanted him to understand that ambition should not be built on the backs of those you love. When the hearing finally came, it wasn't cinematic in the way movies present courtroom drama. It was real and practical. The judge read through affidavits, heard the landlord's statements, and considered the city's preservation rules. Ryan's arguments, which had relied on charm and potential profit, fell flat against documented facts and community testimony. The judge refused to enforce the eviction and ordered mediation between us, emphasizing alternative solutions that respected tenant protections. Mediation was tense. Ryan showed flashes of anger and desperation. He laid out his business case, his timelines, his promises of temporary rent and relocation. But when confronted with the reality that his actions had already caused harm and that he had misrepresented the nature of the intended use, his arguments weakened. We discussed alternatives: finding a legitimate co-working space, leasing a commercial venue, or, if he insisted on remaining local, negotiating fair, transparent terms that didn't displace a tenant. The mediator looked at the binding emotion in the room, my years in the apartment and his desire to grow a business, and suggested solutions that preserved my rights. The day mediation ended, Ryan left in a flurry, angry but constrained. He realized he couldn't steamroll people who had legal protection, community support, and public visibility. In the weeks that followed, the startup idea changed shape. Without the apartment as his base, Ryan had to find a workspace, something real, legal, and above reproach. He took a small office downtown that was expensive but honest. It was a blow to him. He'd expected a shortcut. Instead, he had to take the longer, more ethical road. There was a final twist none of us expected. After the mediation and the legal filings, Ryan's behavior changed. Not overnight, but enough that my daughter noticed. He stopped spending entire days in the apartment. He returned some of the things he'd removed, and he began attending community meetings about ethical startup practices. Whether this was shame, growth, or simply a recalibration, I couldn't say for certain. What I did know was this: my home stayed mine, and the neighborhood learned that protecting elders wasn't just sentimental. It was enforceable. Before I close this part, a word for those still watching. If you're moved by this story, please like and subscribe. Not for drama, but so more people know they have options when facing exploitation. Sharing stories like this helps others find the courage to act. The climax wasn't a dramatic movie-style showdown where I delivered a final line and walked away triumphant. It was quieter. Legal forms filed, community voices raised, investors reconsidering, and a grandson forced to face consequences he had not planned for. The vengeance I sought wasn't to ruin him, but to stop him, to make the harm visible, and to ensure that family could not be so casually monetized. When the dust settled, the apartment remained my sanctuary. I still slept by the same bay window, and the smell of sourdough still drifted up on mornings. The eviction notice had been rescinded, the contractors retreated, and Ryan, chastened and pressed, had to build his dreams on foundations that weren't other people's lives. But there was one final human moment that mattered more than the paperwork. One afternoon, he knocked at my door, eyes tired and softer than they had been. He didn't come with a plan this time. He came with an apology that was not slick or rehearsed, just awkward and honest. "I was wrong," he said. "I didn't think about what I was taking." He sat down, and for the first time in months, we spoke as two people trying to understand each other's truth. It wasn't a reconciliation built in a day, but it was a start. The weeks after the mediation felt surreal. My apartment was safe, my sanctuary intact, and yet the emotional weight of betrayal lingered like a shadow across the sunlit rooms. Walking through each familiar corner, I felt a mix of relief, sorrow, and cautious pride. I had defended not only my home, but my dignity. I had stood firm against someone I loved, and justice, subtle, human, and practical, had prevailed. Ryan's behavior shifted over time. At first, he avoided me, likely nursing a bruised ego and the sting of accountability. Then he began small gestures, returning some things he'd removed, asking about my day, and even sitting down to help with minor chores. There was no instant forgiveness, no magical reconciliation, but there was a shift. He was beginning to understand the consequences of exploiting trust and taking shortcuts over family bonds. I reflected on what had truly worked. Not anger, not dramatics, but methodical planning, clear evidence, and community support. I had reached out to neighbors, enlisted legal counsel, and documented every step of his deception. I realized that revenge, in its most effective form, isn't about humiliation. It's about exposing truth, creating accountability, and protecting what is rightfully yours. The community around me responded in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Neighbors who had watched quietly for years stepped forward with support, sharing observations, evidence, and moral backing. Their presence reinforced a simple truth: strength doesn't exist in isolation. Courage multiplied when shared, and standing together made exploitation far less likely. Emotionally, the experience was transformative. I had felt fear, sadness, and betrayal, but I also discovered a well of resilience I hadn't fully recognized. I realized that age doesn't mean passivity. It can mean clarity, perspective, and the patience to craft a solution that ensures fairness. There were hard lessons. Family can hurt you deeply, even when intentions are masked by charm or ambition. Love doesn't automatically protect you from exploitation. But honesty, persistence, and courage can reclaim not only material possessions, like a home, but also respect and dignity. One evening, Ryan and I sat quietly in the living room, sunlight filtering through the bay window. He didn't make excuses. I didn't offer instant forgiveness. But there was a shared understanding, fragile and tentative, that the bridge between us could be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, and with honesty. For anyone listening, especially older women navigating family conflicts, protecting yourself doesn't mean giving up love. It means respecting your life, your memories, and your rights. Standing firm is not unkind. Sometimes, it is the ultimate act of love, for yourself and for the people around you who need to see that integrity matters. And sometimes karma isn't dramatic or sudden. It's quiet. It's the slow, undeniable consequence of choices that disregard others. In Ryan's case, ambition built on family betrayal met legal reality, community scrutiny, and the sobering awareness of what trust truly means. Consequences arrived, not as punishment, but as life's gentle but firm balance. As I sat in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker across the bay, I felt peace. The eviction notice had been rescinded. My home was intact. My dignity remained. And quietly, a lesson was learned by both of us. Family is precious, trust is sacred, and justice, patient, methodical, and thoughtful, will always find a way. Before I close, a small reminder for those listening. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share, so more people know they can stand up, protect their homes, and claim the respect they deserve.